Around 7 p.m. on Saturday, August 13th, 2011, 19-year-old Wang Weijie was with his friends Ma Jun and Zhou Guo at an internet cafe in the city of Taiping, China, watching Jun play a computer game. Now, Weijie and his friends went to this cafe a lot, and today they had literally been there for hours by this point. But now, as Jun finished up the game he was playing, Guo announced that he was actually ready to go do something else now. So the three of these guys spent a lot of time together, whether it was at an internet cafe or elsewhere. They were like really close friends. And generally speaking, Weijie usually just did whatever Jun and Guo wanted to do, since they both had strong opinions, and Weijie was more of a go-with-the-flow type of guy. And so now, as Guo decided they were done with games, Weijie was just like, all right, cool. Well, why don't we just head back to one of our places just to hang out? But Guo, he shook his head and said, no way, like it's Saturday. They didn't have to be up for school the next day, and so they could stay out all night if they wanted to. And so he said, like, we gotta find something really exciting to do. Like, we gotta make the most of this night. Now, nobody had like a great idea of what was gonna be super exciting. And so Guo was like, all right, well, for now, like, let's just go outside and we can smoke first, and then we can go from there. And at this, both Jun and Weijie just nodded in agreement, like, okay, that's the plan. But in reality, Weijie wasn't really sure if he felt comfortable staying out all night tonight, because tonight was not just a normal night. Like, this was an iffy night to stay out all night. So this particular weekend was not just an ordinary weekend. It was actually the area's annual Ghost Festival, a time on the lunar calendar when ghosts apparently would wander the streets after dark. And Weijie's family, along with his friends' families, and frankly, a lot of other people in this area, they took this festival really seriously. They believed the ghosts really were out wandering the streets after dark because they were just very superstitious. In fact, in this area, this festival was taken so seriously that businesses would often close early so people could safely make their way home before nightfall. Now, Weijie himself didn't really necessarily believe in ghosts, despite his family appearing to very much believe in them. But the reality is Weijie was just not a guy who ruffled feathers. He went with the flow. He was a rule follower. So in his mind, he was thinking, it's the Ghost Festival. Kind of don't want to stay out late tonight. But now, Guo was already making his way towards the exit with Jun, and so Weijie didn't bother to argue. Instead, he just followed right along and they went outside to smoke. About an hour later, Weijie was sitting in the passenger seat of his own car with Jun behind the wheel and Guo in the back, and they were driving down a road in the outskirts of town. And by this point, the sun had set, and so now they were officially in Ghost Festival territory. Like, presumably there are ghosts out now out on the roads. So after leaving the internet cafe, the three of them, they had a smoke, but then as they're out there, they couldn't come up with a compelling idea for how to spend the rest of their big night out. All they came up with is, let's just get in the car and drive around and maybe we'll figure out something to do. Now, initially, when they hopped in the car, they're thinking, okay, it's getting dark out, we're gonna be driving around during the Ghost Festival, we're bound to find something exciting to do. And so all of them are they're amped up, they're in the car, they're pumped, we're gonna find something fun. But after a while, they were just randomly driving around. No one's really out because, again, it's this Ghost Festival. Everybody's, in their homes. There's nothing going on. And it just became really, really boring. They're just driving around and nothing's going on. And so at a certain point, Weijie is just feeling so frustrated because it's he didn't want to be out here in the first place. He didn't voice that to his friends, but he didn't want to be out here. He just wanted to be home. And so he just was man, this is so boring. And he just leaned his head up against the window and just decided to drift off to sleep. And so he's closing his eyes and he's just laying there, and Jun, who's driving, is just, driving along. They're not really talking. And so Weijie, as he's laying there, he suddenly feels the car come to a screeching stop. And Guo in the back seat immediately, reflexively screams at Jun, the driver, hey, what are you doing? Drive more carefully. And Weijie, he's looking around what just happened? And he looks over at Jun, who's driving, and Jun is not paying any attention to Guo or to Weijie. He's just pointing out the windshield at something on the road, and he's look! And so Weijie, who's just sort of confused because a moment ago he was half asleep, he looks from Jun out the front windshield to see what he's pointing at, and there's this woman who's just sitting in the middle of the road. They're out on the outskirts of town. There's no really any buildings around or anything. They're out in the sticks. and it's dark out, and everyone's home for the Ghost Festival, and there's just this woman sitting on the ground. She's wearing this floral dress, and there's a bike that she has that's next to her, just propped up. And she's almost been hit by a car. Like, they stopped very close to her. She's almost been hit by a car, and she's just sitting there staring blankly at the car. And so Jun, he's pointing at her like he can't believe it. He almost hit her, and Wei just like, what's going on? And Guo, like, he doesn't even know what to make of it. And at some point, Jun sort of snaps out of it, and he leans out the window and he yells at the woman to like, get out of the way. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out of the road. But the woman didn't budge. She just sat there staring at them, just on the ground, not a care in the world, just looking right at all three of them. And so eventually, after sort of the tension in the car went down a little bit, Jun just pulled his head back in the window and he looked at his friends and he's like, I don't know. And he just drove around this woman, just avoided her, and they continued driving along. For the next few hours, the three boys just continued driving around town, looking for something to do, but there still was nothing to do. Everything's basically abandoned because it's this Ghost Festival night. Nobody's out, no businesses are open, there's nothing to do. And what really had not left any of their minds, even though they really didn't talk about it, was that woman. Like, that was so unusual to just see her sitting there, not reacting to nearly being hit. Like, the whole thing was just so creepy, made more so because it's the night of this Ghost Festival. Like, talk about the creepiest night to see something like that. And so eventually, around like 1 a.m., when the boys are still just driving around, someone in the car suggests, like, hey, let's go back to that intersection and see if she's still there. Like, let's just see what she's doing. Now, keep in mind, it's been hours since they've seen this woman, like hours. And so they drive back around, not really expecting to see her there. They think that, like, no matter how weird that was, she has to have gotten up and left by now. But no, they turn onto that road, which again is outside of the town. It's like there's no buildings around. It's dark, minus their headlights. And they drive down this road, and sure enough, off in the distance, still sitting in this intersection, is this woman. She's unmoved. She's just sitting there in her dress with a bike next to her, just hours later, no change. And so now it's like the boys can't help but feel really uneasy here. Like, this isn't right. Something's wrong with this woman. I mean, also they can't help but think, like, it's the night of the Ghost Festival. Are we seeing a ghost? Like, they're terrified. I mean, that's the reality, is they were scared. But really, more than anything, what all three of them are thinking and discussing in the car is, we gotta tell someone about her. Like, there's something wrong with this woman. What is she doing? Is she mentally unwell? Is she on drugs? We don't know, but like, this isn't okay. We gotta tell someone. But for now, the three boys decided that they had had enough fun for one night, and they drove to Jun's house, and they just all crashed there, determined to figure out what to do with this woman and what they saw the next day. And so several hours later, the boys wake up, they make their way into the kitchen because they can hear Jun's mom is in there making breakfast. And right away, Jun tells his mom what happened the night before. And as he's regaling her in the details of the story, Jun and Guo also chimed in with their perspective. And then after they were done telling Jun's mom, they all sort of expected her, being an authority figure, to know what to do. That she would very likely say, okay, we need to call the police, or we need to call a hospital, or we need to call some other authority figure and handle this professionally. But she didn't do any of that. Instead, she just kind of looked at the boys and she said, you saw a ghost. Now, at first, all three boys were just shocked at how confidently and calmly she said this. I mean, of course they knew about the annual Ghost Festival, and of course, people in this town were very superstitious, including their own families. They knew this meant a lot, this festival. But the idea that we're gonna sit here and literally say that the woman we saw sitting on the ground last night was a literal ghost, that seemed crazy. And the boys began saying as much to Jun's mom. But Jun's mom was just really annoyed with them and just basically shot them down and said, look, you saw a ghost, but like, that's the reason you're not supposed to be out on the night of the annual Ghost Festival. It's why the business is shut down. It's why we all go home before nightfall. You knew you weren't supposed to be out at night. You were. That's why this happened. Not to mention, these ghosts, they don't just wander around. They target people. You were targeted. Now, Jun's mother was not just throwing that out there. She was referencing one other aspect of this annual Ghost Festival that lots of people in this area believed. which was these ghosts that wandered around after dark on this one night of the year, they weren't just wandering around. They were looking for people to effectively latch onto. And so part of the reason people believed you need to stay in at night and avoid being out after dark is because if you basically interact with one of these ghosts, they could latch onto you and then you become its target. In some cases, people believe it just produces really bad luck for you for potentially months at a stretch. Some other people say that once you've been targeted by one of these ghosts, they may try to kill you. Specifically, they may try to drown you. And so no one really knew, but it was like this belief that you just never want to interact with a ghost because it could be very bad for you. And so June and Guo, they still tried to argue a little with June's mother, trying to tell her that no, this could not possibly be a ghost, but their voices seemed less forceful now, and Weijia, like he was sitting there thinking like, actually, if that was a ghost, this kind of makes sense. It explains why she didn't react at all to nearly being hit by a car. She just sat there. Also, why is she just sitting there? Strange activity for anybody to be doing. Maybe a ghost would do that. It also kind of explains why she was still there hours and hours later, just sitting in the middle of the road. Like other cars must have gone by. Like this is not normal behavior. And so Wei just thinking, wait a minute, maybe this was a ghost. However, just as Weijia really started to feel almost sick with worry about, the seriousness of what had happened, he heard June's mom tell them, don't be afraid. She said, look, I know exactly what you need to do to stay safe. Later that same day, Weijia parked his car at a cemetery that was near June's house. And after he parked, he and June got out while Guo stayed behind in the car. All three of them were very tense. They were very anxious. And as Weijia scanned the headstones and looked over at a cornfield that was next to the cemetery, all he was thinking is this ghost woman is going to appear at any moment and she's going to do something to us. But she didn't. And so eventually, Weijia and June began walking down the path that would lead them through all the gravestones, basically deeper into the cemetery. So the reason these two were here and now walking into the cemetery is because they were following June's mother's advice for how to stay safe now that they had potentially come in contact with this ghost. And so they had gone out and acquired a stack of ghost money, and now they were going to go spend it. So ghost money is a kind of paper sheet in China that typically is burned when a loved one dies. The idea is when you burn this money, it sort of goes to the deceased loved one, and then they have money for the afterlife. You're basically giving your deceased loved one currency for the afterlife. But it can also be a way to buy protection from angry spirits. So Weijia and his friends have been told to burn ghost money over their family grave plots so that their dead ancestors could essentially pay the ghost, the evil ghost, to leave them alone. Now, they'd already done this at Guo's family plot in a separate cemetery, so that's why Guo was staying back in the car, and now they were going to do June's family plot in this cemetery. And so Weijia and June, they continue walking through the cemetery until finally they reach some of June's ancestors' graves. There, they knelt down, they pulled out their ghost money, and they began to burn the bills. And they're both just kneeling there, burning this money. And with each, bill that crumpled up and smoldered, both of them were feeling like this enormous wave of relief coming over them. And so for a little while, they're just burning their money, and they're both looking down at the money on the ground. They're just kneeling there. But then at some point, Weijia just looked up. And as soon as he did, he froze. Because standing right behind June can't see this, right behind June is that woman in a dress. And she's looking at both of them. And Weijia was so scared, he shrieked, he jumped up, turned, and started running in the opposite direction. Now June is so startled by Weijia screaming that he jumped up, ready to run away himself, but he's watching Weijia take off, and he turns around because he could tell Weijia saw something behind him, but there's nothing behind him. And he's thinking he must have seen the ghost, because why else would he react this way? But there's nobody here. And so June sort of put together, like, what's going on here? Like, Weijia clearly spooked himself. We're in a cemetery after all. And he sees Weijia, and he's running, and he disappears into the cornfield that was next to the cemetery. He's just gone, just running, he's gone. Now, this cornfield was pretty massive. It had not been harvested, so the stalks were really tall. And clearly, like, Weijia was on a mission, and so June was not about to just chase after him. Instead, he ran back to the car and he grabbed Guo first, and the two of them went after Weija. However, when they got to the cornfield and actually went inside of it, they quickly realized it was going to be really hard to find anything in this cornfield. I mean, the stalks are so thick and tall, it's so dense. I mean, every step was so slow and difficult, and they're calling out for Weija, but there's no response. And so after several minutes of only moving, like 10, 15 feet or so into this cornfield, making no progress, the two of them are like, what happened to him? Like, either the ghost got him, or like maybe he's in hiding somewhere. Maybe he's convinced that the ghost is nearby and he's just being quiet and he's in hiding and he's somewhere in this cornfield, but we gotta find him. And so the two friends, they back out of the cornfield and they end up calling a bunch of their friends to meet them at this cornfield and help them look for Weija. So all these friends, they eventually arrive, and all day and into the night, these friends search this cornfield. They're looking everywhere for Weija. Everyone's screaming his name, but there's no sign of him. 3 days later, and Weija still had not been found. Now, by this point, the parents, Weija's parents, had been told. They had told police. Police had looked for Weija, but there was no sign of him. I mean, they were still out looking for him, but right now, like the talk of the town was, where is Weija? Nobody knew. And so on this day, 3 days after the day that Weija went missing, Jun was sitting in his room just feeling miserable. All he can think about is his friend and what happened to him. Like, he ran off after presumably seeing this ghost. Like, did the ghost get him? Like, all these horrible thoughts are going through his head. And Jun, as he's sitting in his room, he hears his mom call out to him, telling him there's a visitor. And so Jun, he gets up, he leaves his room, he goes to the front of the house, and he sees a police officer standing in the doorway. And this officer would tell Jun and his mother that they had found Weija, and he was dead. His body was found in a lake that was not far from the cemetery, and that he had drowned. Jun is completely shocked. I mean, on the one hand, he sort of was expecting bad news at this point. I mean, basically everybody was. But to hear that his friend was dead was just horrific, and he really struggled to keep back tears. But, before he could really even react to this, the officer went on to say that, Jun, we spoke to Weija's parents and they told us that you and Guo were with their son last, that you were with him before he vanished. And so we just want you to tell us, now that we know he passed away, that he drowned, we want to know what happened. What did you see? Like, what led to him drowning? And Jun, he just launched into the most detailed version of the story he could possibly think of. He took the officer all the way back to them at the internet cafe, playing computer games. They decide they're going to stay out all night. They go outside, they're having a smoke, they're talking about what they're going to do. They decide they're going to get in the car and just drive around. They're driving around on the night of this ghost festival. They see this woman, they think it's a ghost. Like, he went through this whole rendition of the ghost being really central to the story, and how the next day Jun's mom had said, oh, go burn ghost money in the cemetery to protect yourself from the spirits. They go to the cemetery and they're burning the ghost money, but then Weija, he gets so scared. Jun's convinced it's because he sees the ghost again, this woman, and he takes off running into the cornfield. So he tells the officer every little detail. And he knew that even in a place like this, where people did, for the most part, believe in ghosts, he knew his story really hinged on a ghost made Weija do this. And he knew that it was totally preposterous in some ways, but he thinks he's telling him the truth. And so he tells the officer all this stuff. And the officer's just staring at him, and he's clearly very skeptical. And then at some point, after Jun is done, and he's just waiting for the officer looks at him, and he asks him one question that once he answers honestly, it completely explains everything that happened. It would turn out that woman who was sitting in the middle of the road that sort of became the centerpiece of this whole ordeal was not a ghost. In fact, she wasn't even real. Because the three friends, Jun, Guo, and Weija, on the night they decide to have their big night, they're going to stay out all night. When they went out for a smoke, they didn't smoke cigarettes. They smoked methamphetamine, which can cause you to hallucinate. And so they were high on meth driving around and hallucinated that woman. But they all, believed they saw it, and it felt so real, and it was on the same night as this annual ghost festival that it felt so real that even the next day, when they were no longer high, they still believed they had seen it. And then June's mom confirmed, yep, that was a ghost, because she believes in ghosts. And so they set out to the cemetery, and they're gonna, burn this ghost money to save themselves from these evil spirits. And what do they do before they head out to the cemetery? They smoke more meth. And Waya, he has another hallucination. He thinks he sees the ghost, ran into the cornfield, not realizing that deep in the cornfield was a lake. He fell into it, and he was high on meth and didn't know how to swim, and so he drowned. And now let's get into our second story called A Wild Night Out. On the night of August 28, 2004, a 21-year-old named John Hutcherson leaned over a bar in Marietta, Georgia, and asked the bartender for another beer. John, by this point, had completely lost track of how many drinks he had had in the past few hours, but he was sure it had been a lot, because by this point the room was starting to spin. However, he had no plans to stop drinking anytime soon. After all, it was only midnight, which was very early for John, and he was having a great time, and the bar was packed, and there was loud music playing, and John was also on a winning streak, playing pool. And so while he waited for his beer, John looked over at the pool table. He had left his best friend Frankie there a few minutes ago, but now, as he was looking over there, he didn't see Frankie anymore. So John and Frankie had been very close ever since high school, and this night out they were having was sort of like a typical Saturday for them. Every week they would meet at this bar, they would get exceptionally drunk, and they would basically stay out all night. But on this night, they were both a lot drunker than usual, and now Frankie was gone. And so as John very drunkenly looked around the bar to see if he could find Frankie, he noticed a girl he didn't recognize at the end of the bar. She was very cute, and she appeared to be smiling at him. And so, John sees her and forgets all about his friend Frankie being gone and just smiles back at this girl. And then a moment later, the bartender hands him his beer, and John's feeling really confident. He takes his beer and he begins walking towards this girl. However, before he actually reached her, he felt a hand on his arm, and he turned to see Frankie, who looked just awful. He looked so pale, he smelled like vomit. And Frankie told John, as well as he could, because he's so drunk, he's mumbling everything. He just said he felt horrible and it was time to go. Now, John was really disappointed because even though he was really, really drunk too, he wasn't as bad as Frankie. Like, John had not reached the nauseous and vomiting phase of extreme intoxication. And so he's thinking, man, there are a couple more hours till closing and I really want to talk to this girl. But he was Frankie's ride, and Frankie had to go home, clearly, and so if he was going home, John had to go home too. So John just chugged his beer, put it back on the bar, and then he turned and kind of waved at the girl, being like, sorry, I gotta go. And then John pulled his car keys out of his pocket. And so John and Frankie, they head outside to the parking lot, and John goes to his truck, and he climbs into the driver's seat. And as he's fumbling with the keys to start the car, Frankie had gone around to the other side and stumbled his way into the passenger seat. And even though he's wrecked drunk, he's totally out of it, Frankie looks over at John and sees him unable to even start the car. And he's like, hey, are you sure you're good to drive? And John looks over at Frankie and he's like, of course, I'm just fine. I do this every single week. We always get home safe. And so at this point, Frankie's like, all right, whatever, let's just go. And so John, he eventually manages to turn the car on. He throws it in gear. And he began to pull out of the parking lot onto the road, but as he did, he really had to squint his eyes just to see the road clearly. His whole world is totally spinning because of how intoxicated he was. And then as soon as he actually began driving down the main road on the way home, the first thing he did is he's hitting the curb and swerving back onto the road, but he was, basically steady. He's totally wasted, but he's basically hanging on. And then the rest of the drive was just a blur. John was white knuckling it the rest of the way, He's driving along, he sees the gas station that he always passed on the way home, so that's a familiar landmark, he's going the right way. He eventually passes a familiar billboard, but then at some point his eyes snap back into focus because he realizes he's swerving off the road onto the shoulder, but he swerves back just in time to avoid hitting a telephone pole. And he's like, oh man, I got this, stay focused. And then somehow, some way, eventually he winds up in front of Frankie's house. And so he drops his friend off, and then back on the road he goes, navigating now at this point, like with one eye shut. And he eventually finds his way to his parents' house where he was staying. And from there, he climbed out of his car, he walked up the driveway, he unlocked the front door, and then stumbled up to his room where he immediately just fell into his bed and passed out. The next thing John knew, he heard voices, and then he felt somebody grab his arm and shake him. And then when he opened his eyes, his vision was very blurry, but eventually it came into focus, and he saw that he was clearly in his bedroom, in his bed, on top of his blankets, but he had no idea how he got there. He looked down and noticed he was still wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but they were sticky and they were dirty. And then there were also these two figures who were standing over him, repeating his name over and over again, almost angrily. John looked at these two and didn't really know who they were, but then he noticed they were both wearing matching uniforms. They were police officers. And these officers were very angrily asking John, what happened last night? Like, what did you do? What happened the night before? But John, he still is sort of trying to figure out what's even going on. He really doesn't have a good memory of anything that happened the night before. I mean, all he can just quickly remember is he was at that bar, he saw that girl, he drove Frankie home, he knew he was drunk on the ride home, but he got home. He didn't know what else they were trying to figure out about what happened the night before. And so when he finally opened his mouth to be like, what is going on? Because he was still basically drunk, it just came out of his mouth like this incoherent babbling. He was like, what's going on here? And the two officers, they were just over it, and they just grabbed John and literally pulled him out of the bed. They whipped his hands behind his back, they handcuffed him, and John, who's like, what is happening? They lead him out of his bedroom, downstairs, past his mom and dad, who are staring at him like, what is going on? And even though John, again, is basically borderline incoherent, in passing by his parents, he's hoping they're gonna be like, hey, officers, why are you arresting my son? But instead, as he's led past them, he looks at his mom and dad, and they're not about to put up some fight. They're crying. They're holding each other and crying. They clearly know something bad has happened, and they can't stop what's happening to their son. And so the officers, they walk John in handcuffs out the front door, and they walk him over to his truck in the driveway. And when they got there, the officers just stopped and gestured for John to have a look inside. And so John, he's sort of looking at the officers like, okay, what's going on with my truck? And he turned and he just sort of squinted and looked through the window into the car. And there was this large object in the passenger seat that he didn't remember being there the night before. Then as he looked more closely, he realized with horror what it was. So the night before, John did drive when he absolutely should not have. He was clearly way past the legal limit for driving. He should never have been driving, totally unsafe for others, for him. Shouldn't have happened, but he did. He drove. And so he and Frankie, they're driving home, and John, in his limited memory, recalled, this sort of blurry ride home, where basically, as dangerous as it was, he got them home. But at one point, he remembered almost hitting a telephone pole, and he swerved just in time, and he narrowly avoided it. And in some ways, that was true. He did avoid smashing into the telephone pole, but he didn't avoid an incident. So Frankie, because he was so nauseous from having drank too much, he had his head out the window as they were driving along trying to get some fresh air. And when John drove too close to that telephone pole and swerved at the last second, Frankie's head was still out the window, and his head was decapitated by one of the tension wires coming off the pole. The tight wire that holds that pole into the ground, one of them, it's like a guillotine, and they're speeding past it, and Frankie's neck hit the wire, off went his head. But his body remained in the passenger seat of the car, and John was so belligerently drunk that he didn't see he had just killed his friend, nor did he see his friend's body, or a part of his body, still in his car. And so when John drunkenly arrived at Frankie's house, and he's like, all right, bye, he thought maybe Frankie got out of the car, but clearly he didn't. He was just there, dead, in his passenger seat. And then John just drove back to his parents' house and just left the car in the driveway with his friend's body inside, and up to his bedroom he went and passed out, having no idea what he had just done. A few months later, John would plead guilty to vehicular homicide, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Around 2:30 a.m. on November 4th, 1997, 49-year-old Delma Ramsey slid her keys into the lock of the McDonald's in the suburb of Germantown, Tennessee. Delma was still groggy from having just woken up, but she could do this opening procedure in her sleep. She'd been working this shift every weekday for over 20 years. So she barely even had to think as she opened up the door, slipped inside, then used her keys to lock it up again behind her. It was company policy that the doors remained locked whenever the restaurant was closed. But Delma had always felt like the intense security measures here were sort of unnecessary in Germantown. It was a really safe city just outside of Memphis, and they really didn't have much crime. But if it was important to McDonald's, it was important to Delma. Delma was this McDonald's opening assistant manager, and she loved her job, which she never would have guessed she'd be saying now when she began working there over 2 decades ago. At the time, she'd just been bored and looking for something to do. She didn't have any kids, and her husband Dennis worked a lot. But now, McDonald's was like her whole life. She hadn't just found a career, she'd found a whole second family, between her coworkers and the regulars that she saw every morning. So this job was not just a source of income, it was a source of happiness for Delma, and she took it really seriously. After getting inside the building, Delma hurried over to a security system panel and punched in a code, which deactivated the alarm. She then took her coat off and straightened her McDonald's apron as she headed towards the back office. But as she passed through the kitchen to get there, she heard something. It was a bunch of loud, yowling noises. They were coming from outside, right behind a door that led to a back alley. And Delma suddenly felt very awake, because hearing these sounds made her angry. It meant almost definitely that a local couple named Ted and Lisa were in that back alley feeding the stray cats again. And this was a major headache for Delma, because these stray cats would get into the McDonald's dumpsters, and they yowled and they had fleas. Delma had already reached out to animal control once before about these cats, but this couple kept putting food out, so the cats just kept coming back. And so Delma considered right now going outside to see if the couple was still there. But she decided against it. She really didn't like confrontation, and based on her past interactions with Ted, she knew it would just turn into a huge fight. Instead, she just carried on with her morning. She headed to the restaurant's tiny office, where the safe was. This office was more like a closet than an office, but it had enough room for Delma to sit inside and count out the money that was in the safe to put into the registers. And this process today was pretty easy, since the other manager, Kareem Collier, had closed up last night and had made sure all the cash was neatly organized and accounted for. It was around 3 a.m. when Delma was finally done. She turned away from the safe and reached for the office phone. It was time to call and wake up one of her employees, Emma Owens, so she could make it to the McDonald's in time for her 4 a.m. shift. So Delma dialed and then waited for Emma's voice on the other end. And when she groggily picked up, Delma told her it was go time, then she hung up. Delma made this wake-up call every single morning that Emma worked. And by this point, it was more a tradition than an actual necessity. Emma was about 10 years older than Delma, but they were best friends, more like family really than coworkers. In fact, Delma had even gotten close to Emma's actual family, including her 2 grandsons, Maurice Lane and Robert Evans, who'd actually worked at the McDonald's for a while before moving to Illinois. This really was what Delma loved about this job, the community. Delma didn't have much family of her own since her mom and brother lived out of state, and she barely saw her husband, Dennis. Delma puttered around the McDonald's getting things ready until about 4 a.m., at which point she heard a knock on the door at the south side of the building, where all employees entered during off hours. That meant Emma and the other morning server, Douglas Powell, must have arrived. So Delma straightened her apron once again and made sure her uniform was just right. She was the leader of the shift, so she always wanted to make sure she looked polished and capable. Then, when she was ready, she headed over to let them in. The shift wound up being uneventful, and before Delma knew it, 9 hours had passed and she was back in her Pontiac, making the 10-mile journey home to the nearby town of Collierville. Delma parked and went inside the house to find it empty and quiet, like it usually was. Delma's husband of 31 years, Dennis, was in construction, and he was usually gone when Delma came home from her shift. Sometimes they'd go a full week without even seeing each other. Dennis's long shifts used to bother Delma way back before she started at McDonald's, but now she had her plate full at the restaurant, so she was simply too busy to feel lonely. After settling in, Delma made herself some food, called her mom who lived in Michigan, then caught up on some reading. and it wasn't long before it was time to turn in. After all, she had to be up by 2 a.m. again to get to her shift on time. The next morning, November 5th, just before 2:20 a.m., Delma walked up to the side door of the McDonald's like she always did, with a ring of keys in her hand. And, just like always, she unlocked the door, went inside, locked it behind her, and then deactivated the alarm. Delma then took off her coat, and she began adjusting her apron as she started walking towards the back office. However, something caught her eye, and she stopped. There was a figure standing at the window of the McDonald's right by the door she had just entered from. For a second, Delma was startled. But then the figure knocked on the glass, and Delma realized who it was. And when she did, she broke into a wide smile. She was surprised, but very happy to see this person, and she went over immediately, unlocked the door again, and invited them inside. Delma spent the next half hour chatting happily with her unexpected visitor. She did this until about 3 a.m., at which point she went to the office to make her regular phone call to Emma. After telling Emma that it was time to get up, she hung up the phone, and that's when she heard her visitor say something from behind her. "15 minutes later, Delma's friend and employee, Emma Owens, was getting dressed when she heard her phone ring again. It actually spooked her. Nobody would be calling her this early except Delma, who she'd already spoken to. And so Emma went over and picked it up, expecting to hear Delma's voice because who else would be calling her? But instead of hearing her friend's voice, nobody said anything. Instead, Emma heard this weird sound on the other end. It sounded almost like gurgling. Emma demanded to know who was calling, but whoever it was just kept making this gurgling sound. Emma felt annoyed, because to her, this clearly must be a prank call, and it just felt really obnoxious for someone to do this to her so early in the morning. So she slammed the receiver down and looked over at her clock. If she didn't get moving soon, she was going to be late. Around 4 a.m., Emma drove into the lot of the McDonald's and pulled into a space. Like always, Delma's white Pontiac was already there, parked on the south side of the building. When Emma got out and walked over to the employee entrance, she saw the other morning server, Douglas, had just arrived too. So, together, they knocked on the door and then waited. But Delma did not come to unlock the door and let them in. And so after a minute or two, Emma walked over to a window and looked inside. But she didn't see Delma anywhere. Douglas suggested that maybe Delma could be in the basement, getting restock items, and just couldn't hear them. Emma nodded, but inside she's thinking Delma would not lose track of time like this. She's always here at 4 a.m. to let us in. Why wouldn't she be here now? After knocking a few more times and still not getting an answer from Delma, Emma started to feel nervous. This had never happened before. Delma always came to the door. And so Emma decided she needed to do something other than just standing here, because, who knows, maybe something's wrong. So she went back to her car, turned it on, and just began driving around the McDonald's a few times and beeping her horn the whole time, so that maybe if Delma was inside and distracted, she would certainly hear this and come outside to see what was going on. But Delma still didn't come out. And so at this point, Emma just felt like something has to be wrong here. Finally, after about 10 minutes, Douglas decided to just go home, and Emma drove away too. But unlike Douglas, Emma was not going home. She was going to find a phone because she knew she had to call the police. A few minutes later, at 4:23 a.m., 2 officers pulled up to the McDonald's in their cruiser. And right away they noticed the restaurant was quiet, dark, and deserted, which was not how either of them were used to seeing it. This McDonald's was a favorite for cops who worked the graveyard shift since it was one of the only places that opened up at 5 a.m. So they'd both been there plenty of times, and they knew from experience that there was always a whole bunch of activity inside the McDonald's in the hour leading up to opening. So the idea that it's shut down this close to opening didn't make any sense. But the officers did understand from the 911 call that apparently there was some sort of issue with the employee of this McDonald's who was supposed to be opening up the store. So the officers hurried up to the front entrance, but they found the double doors were locked. And when the officers knocked and called out that they were police, there was no answer from inside. So they began shining their flashlights through the windows to see who was inside, but they didn't have a clear view of the whole restaurant. So they went around the side of the building to keep looking for a way in. As they circled the perimeter, they kept peering through the restaurant's big glass windows, trying to see anybody inside or anything of note. But there was nothing. It just seemed like a quiet, abandoned restaurant. Until they got to the drive-thru. There, when they actually looked through the drive-thru window, they saw a woman, and she was lying motionless and bloody on the floor of the kitchen. They couldn't tell if she was alive or dead, and they couldn't just climb through the drive-thru window because they couldn't open it. But even just from the outside, they could tell that whatever happened to this person, it had not been an accident. And so the officers got on their radios to call for an ambulance and for backup. About a half an hour later, at around 5 a.m., Detective Danny Payne walked up to the McDonald's, which was now crowded with officers, crime scene technicians, and also yellow tape. Payne already knew the basics. There had been some sort of violent attack on a woman identified as Delma Ramsey, the assistant manager of the McDonald's who had the morning shift. Delma had been brutally beaten around her face and head, and she was alive and had been taken to the hospital, but it was looking unlikely that she'd survive. Payne had been on the force for a while, but this was not the kind of case he or anybody on his squad had much experience with. There hadn't been a homicide in Germantown in 5 years, and while there had been a few robberies here and there, nobody had ever been seriously injured during one. So, Payne knew there was going to be a lot of attention on him and this case, and he was already worried about the state of the crime scene. Because Delma was alive when the police and EMTs got inside, crime scene protocols had gone out the window. They had been focused entirely on just saving Delma's life, not preserving the scene, which of course they should be. But it also meant that Payne was likely looking at a lot of contaminated evidence. Payne walked into the McDonald's through a door on the north side of the restaurant, which he had been told was found unlocked. That was actually how the officers were finally able to get inside and reach Delma. When Payne got inside, he took a minute to just walk around the restaurant and look at the other doors and windows, and all of them were intact. So there was no clear sign of forced entry anywhere. But he also knew that very likely the north side door had been open, and very likely the attacker just used that to go inside. The inside of the restaurant was the sort of typical layout you would expect out of a McDonald's, with the dining area in front of a fast food counter that led back to the kitchen. And as Payne walked around, he couldn't see signs of disturbance at all. So he headed behind the counter and into the back part of the kitchen where the drive-thru was. Now, the space was pretty narrow, and it basically was just big enough for somebody to stand there and hand food out the window to whoever was going through the drive-thru. And when he got back there, the first thing Payne noticed was the large pool of blood on the floor, the spot where Delma had been found lying. And around this pool of blood were all these bloody footprints and discarded medical gauze, and even though he had expected this, Payne was still feeling kind of annoyed. He would have virtually no idea what trace evidence came from the attacker or the paramedics. And that was not the only issue. The room, because it was a McDonald's, was also covered in grease, which Payne knew would make analyzing blood spatter almost impossible, since blood sort of beads up on greasy surfaces, which also makes trying to determine directionality of blood spatter really hard to read. And while getting fingerprints would be something they could definitely do back here, the reality was, a McDonald's was not like a living room, where cops would only expect to find maybe a few individuals' prints. Between workers and cleaners and service people and customers and now first responders as well, Payne knew he could be looking at least a dozen different people's prints all over the place, if not more. On the other side of the pool of blood was a small office with its door wide open and 4 empty cash drawers on the floor in front of it. When Payne walked over to the office, he also saw there was an open safe inside, and the safe was empty. And so at this point, Payne had a theory. This was a robbery, and Delma was collateral damage. There wasn't much else to look at inside the McDonald's. The attack had been contained to that back kitchen area, which suggested the attack had happened really quickly. Payne was about to head outside when he was approached by a man who introduced himself as Larry Graves, the security manager for the building. He'd been sent to do an assessment of the damage, and as far as he could tell, there was about $1,200 missing from the safe. Larry then rattled off a whole bunch of other things he felt like Payne should know, such as only managers, like Delma, had the combination to that safe, and according to their system, the alarm was disarmed inside the building around 2:20 a.m., most likely by Delma, who was the only one on shift until 4 a.m. Also, he told Payne that employees are told to keep all doors locked when the restaurant was not open. After Larry said this, Payne realized Larry's information narrowed down the timeline significantly, which was huge. It meant the attack likely had happened between 2:20 a.m. when the alarm was disarmed and just before 4 a.m. when the 911 call came in. But it was actually the $1,200 that really stuck out to him. It was kind of a small amount of money, given how truly badly Delma was beaten for it. It could just mean that the robber didn't realize how much money was actually in the safe, and they just kind of attacked Delma because she was in the way. But it could also mean that getting the cash was not really their ultimate goal. Perhaps hurting Delma was. Payne thanked Larry, then headed outside to keep looking around. Outside, officers and crime techs surrounded the exterior of the building, taking photos and dropping evidence markers. One officer stood in a patch of grass between the McDonald's and the restaurant next door, holding a camera. And when he saw Payne, he waved the detective over and pointed down at something in the grass. Payne walked over and he looked down, and he saw the officer had found a set of keys. And clearly, these keys had blood on them. Payne guessed the keys, which were not car keys, they were like keys to a building, must be Delma's, since she was the restaurant opener, and the paramedics had not mentioned finding any keys on her body. But the fact that these keys were outside and Delma was inside meant her attacker must have taken these keys from her and thrown or dropped them as they left. And this was important, because it meant that the open door the police had found most likely had not just been left open by Delma like they initially thought. Instead, the attacker must have taken Delma's keys after the attack to unlock the door from the inside in order to leave the restaurant, basically following the attack. The keys got them out of the restaurant. And so Payne immediately began to reevaluate his entire theory of the case. If Delma had not left the door open and there was no forced entry, that likely meant she let her attacker inside. And this was huge, because it meant that this attack/robbery was not random. And so Delma must have known her attacker and trusted them in order to allow them into the building before it was open. And based on what Larry said, Delma was both the only one on shift and she knew the safe combo. That told Payne whoever attacked her very likely knew she'd be alone and that she would have access to the cash. So likely the attacker did not just know Delma, they also knew McDonald's policy too. And so after thinking about this, Payne turned and jogged back into the restaurant to catch Larry before he left, because what he needed was a list of all the McDonald's employees who worked with Delma. A few hours later, Payne was back at the station, hurrying towards an interrogation room. He was moving fast because the day wasn't even halfway through, and already his entire investigation had changed again. And that's because he'd just gotten word from the hospital that Delma Ramsey had died from her injuries. Payne was now officially the lead detective in a murder investigation. But so far, he didn't have much to go on. The crime scene techs hadn't been able to lift any fingerprints or find any immediately useful pieces of evidence at the crime scene that would point to any one suspect. The morning's canvass efforts had not revealed much either. Even though this McDonald's was right in the middle of town, none of the employees at the businesses around it had seen or heard anything unusual that morning. Most of them hadn't even been at work yet. The only thing they had found was that the bank across the street from the McDonald's had an ATM at the front of the building. And pretty much all ATMs have a built-in camera. And this one did, and it happened to be pointed directly at the McDonald's. Now, Payne had already seen the footage, which did clearly show someone arriving at the McDonald's just after Delma got there, and it also filmed the building during the time that Delma was most likely attacked. But the video quality was terrible, and Payne couldn't make out any of this other person's features. Even so, he could see that this other person had entered the McDonald's really quickly, which meant Payne had been right. Delma let them inside, and quickly, so she clearly must have known them. But this actually didn't necessarily narrow down the list of suspects very much, because from what Payne had heard so far, basically every early bird in Germantown knew Delma. She was very well liked in the community, and a fixture at this McDonald's. Even some of the officers knew her. But the footage did give Payne one more clue. The killer approached the restaurant on the south side of the building, which Payne had learned was where employees entered. It could be a coincidence, or the killer was an employee or a former employee and had just naturally gravitated towards the entrance they were most familiar with. Payne had already asked the security manager for a list of employees, so he was waiting on that. And he had also already spoken with Delma's family, which basically was just her husband, Dennis, and so he had been notified and was someone they would very likely need to speak to soon. But for now, he was working the employee angle, and so he was on his way to speak with Emma Owen, who was one of Delma's coworkers and happened to be one of the last people to actually speak to Delma. A few minutes later, Payne sat down across a table from Emma. She was in her late 50s and seemed nervous, and so Payne tried to be as gentle as he could, but ultimately just had to come out and say it, that Delma was dead, and she clearly had been murdered. When Emma heard this, her eyes filled with tears, and she began shaking her head repeatedly, almost like she was trying to wake herself up. And then she just blurted out something that was very surprising. She said that she had made a mistake. In a shaking voice, she explained that Delma had called her that morning at 3 a.m. to wake her up like she normally did, and she had sounded just fine. Then about 15 minutes later, Emma's phone rang again, and when Emma picked up, she heard a gurgling on the other end. She said she thought it was a prank, and it hadn't even occurred to her to check the caller ID. It was so early in the morning, and she didn't want to be late for work. But now she wondered, did that call have something to do with what happened to Delma? Payne sat very still as the gravity of what Emma was saying hit him. If the call she was describing did come from the McDonald's, it meant that Delma had likely called Emma during or immediately after the attack. Maybe she had tried to call 911 but just hit redial, or maybe she had called Emma on purpose in a panic. And if the call really was Delma, it also shrank the window of time the murder could have occurred even further. Delma was alive and well at 3 a.m. when she first called Emma, and then less than 15 minutes later, she was in trouble. Payne told Emma that yes, the call could mean something. He asked if he could send an officer to her house to look at her caller ID. She nodded, but then she burst into tears again and explained this was not just some coworker's death. Delma was like her family. They'd worked that morning shift together for the last 5 years. Delma had even taken her grandsons under her wing and given them jobs there before they moved to Illinois. This was just a huge loss. Payne took all of this down, and then he had Emma walk through her entire timeline of that morning, through her arrival at McDonald's with another employee named Douglas Powell and sort of what they did when Delma didn't come to the door. And Emma would say, they basically just stood at the employee entrance, and then Emma said she did drive around the building, but she didn't look closely enough because she didn't see Delma inside, and they also didn't know another door was open because they didn't walk around. Pretty quickly, Payne decided that Emma was not a great suspect. She had no obvious motivation, and she also was there with another employee who could potentially back up her story. And also, Delma's injuries were so severe that Payne sort of doubted Emma, who was not particularly big, was capable of even inflicting them. However, Emma's story about that second phone call she got that morning was weighing on Payne. Payne was pretty sure that Delma's killer had arrived at the McDonald's around 2:22 a.m., as that ATM security footage showed. The fact that Delma had called Emma at 3 a.m., sounding normal, meant that Delma's killer had been inside the restaurant for over half an hour with Delma before they attacked her. So the killer really had to be somebody Delma not only knew, but knew pretty well. And so Payne felt like now was the time to speak to Delma's husband. About an hour later, a very red-eyed and disoriented 50-year-old man named Dennis Ramsey arrived at the station. When Payne sat down with him in the interrogation room, Dennis stumbled his way through some general pieces of information that Payne already knew. That Delma had worked at the McDonald's for over 20 years, that everybody loved her, and her customers were basically her second family. But Dennis just kept losing his train of thought and starting over and over again. Payne's gut told him that Dennis seemed genuinely distraught here and could even be in shock. However, that didn't make him innocent. So as Dennis kind of rambled on, Payne checked him out, looking up and down, looking for any marks on his hands or arms, any scratches or cuts, which he would expect a killer to have after pummeling someone as badly as Delma had been. But he didn't see any of these marks on Dennis. Dennis seemed like he was trying his best to be cooperative, so Payne took a risk and just was very blunt. He asked Dennis where he was between 2 and 3:30 a.m. that morning. Dennis blinked at him, looking surprised, and then just said he was sleeping. Delma always left before he got up in the morning, but realistically, he wouldn't have noticed anyways, since they slept in separate rooms. He said he actually hadn't seen her in days. And at this, Payne tensed up. Sleeping in separate rooms could mean marriage problems, and a husband claiming he was asleep during the murder of his wife was not a good alibi. But before Payne could ask him anything else, Dennis suddenly had this alarmed look come over his face, and Payne sort of knew why. It was clear that Dennis had come out of his shock enough to realize he was now a suspect. It was like a switch had flipped. Dennis stopped stuttering and repeating himself and started saying forcefully that he had nothing to do with Delma's murder. He said he would answer any questions the police had because he had nothing to hide. And Payne said that was great to hear, because what he'd really love for him to do is take a lie detector test. The following afternoon, a little over 24 hours after Delma's murder, Payne sat in his office looking at a document he had just been handed. It was the autopsy report, and it was horrifying. Now, Payne already knew, as everybody else did in this case, that Delma clearly had been savagely beaten, so he was not surprised to find out she had fractures all over her body and face. However, the autopsy also said that in addition to being beaten, Delma also had been strangled, apparently with the strings from her McDonald's apron. The physical beating already indicated extreme and emotional violence, but also strangling her with an apron was overkill. To Payne, this indicated either a very personal kind of hatred or panic. And so now, Payne was starting to wonder if the robbery really was just an attempt to cover up the murder, or maybe just a bonus on top of the murder, because it seemed like whoever had taken the money was furious with Delma. Delma's husband, Dennis, was the person closest to Delma, at least at first glance, and it seemed possible their marriage could be on the rocks. Plus, he had no alibi. The police now knew exactly when the killing occurred because they had confirmed on Emma's caller ID that that call with the gurgling sounds had come from the McDonald's. And so during that 15 minutes between the call to Emma and the gurgling call, Dennis had only his word that he was asleep, nobody to back that up. However, Dennis had taken and passed a number of polygraph tests, which, for Payne was enough to basically eliminate him and turn his attention back to his previous theory, a fellow employee. Payne had gotten a list of over 100 current and past employees of this McDonald's, and he'd already worked through some of them. Emma, her grandsons, Douglas Powell, and the night manager Kareem Collier. But so far, they'd all been eliminated. And so since Payne did not seem to be getting anywhere with the evidence he had, he decided it was time to turn to the public for some information. The following day, Detective Payne and his team sorted through tips from a Crime Stoppers phone line, which is a fully anonymous tip line. Payne had set it up in the hopes that somebody from the community would come forward with information about the murder. And Payne was excited to see that leads were already pouring in. And some of them appeared to be promising, like there were 2 former employees with criminal records who a tipster thought could be capable of violence. And so Payne and his team quickly picked up these former employees for an interrogation, but quickly realized there was no physical evidence to link them to Delma. Other tips came from concerned citizens or residents reporting suspicious neighbors or lingering vehicles, and one by one, Payne and his team looked into all of them, but one by one, they all went nowhere. 10 days after the murder, somebody called in to claim that a waitress at a local restaurant had been taking credit for killing Delma, and on top of that, Payne discovered this waitress was affiliated with a local gang. But when Payne actually interviewed her, it was clear she didn't know Delma at all and didn't know any of the specifics of the crime, and so it wound up being a total waste of their time. At the same time they were running down all these tips, Payne and his team kept going through that list of McDonald's employees, interviewing everybody who still lived in the area. But every employee had an alibi. And as the days turned into weeks, Payne started to feel like instead of getting closer to an answer, he just kept on getting farther away. In between all the tips and the interviews, Payne would read and reread his files, and he would rewatch the ATM footage over and over to see if he missed anything. But by the spring of 1998, after more than 6 months during which Payne had interviewed 246 people, he still had nothing. So, that April, he and some members of his team just started all over. They sat in his office and pored over the original case file from the beginning. And when they did this, they actually did find something huge. 2 weeks after Delma had been killed, someone had called in a tip to the Crime Stoppers hotline. But because there had been so many tips, this one had sort of gotten lost in the shuffle. But the tipster said that Delma, who everybody claimed was universally adored, actually had 2 enemies. A couple named Ted Lawrence and Lisa Franklin. The couple often hung out behind the McDonald's early in the morning to feed stray cats that lived there. And apparently, Delma had been trying to get them to stop. This had created tension between the 3 of them to the point where Ted actually had public fights with Delma. One time, he had actually approached her during her shift and screamed about utensils being missing from his order. Now, this information certainly suggested that, Ted and Lisa did not like Delma, but could they really have brutally murdered her over a bunch of cats? When Payne looked further into Ted and Lisa, he learned that Lisa ran a soap and lotion store that was about a half block from the McDonald's, and he also found a Honda CRX was registered to Ted Lawrence. Payne immediately thought back to that ATM footage he had watched countless times and realized maybe he'd missed something. Payne jumped up and sprinted down the hall to the evidence locker. Moments later, Payne was staring at the TV screen, once again watching the grainy ATM video surveillance from the night Delma was killed. Only this time, he was not looking at the McDonald's or that blurry figure he had been so sure was the killer. Instead, he was staring at the parking lot. Because around 2 a.m., just minutes before Delma had arrived for her shift, at the far edge of the lot was a Honda. Payne sat back, feeling totally stunned. Finally, he had a good suspect. A few weeks later, 31-year-old Ted and 47-year-old Lisa were brought in and split up to be interrogated. Payne first sat down with Ted, who just seemed frustrated at being there. His arms were crossed, and his eyes behind a pair of glasses were narrowed with annoyance. Payne had guessed that Ted could be difficult. The tip line info had mentioned his big fight with Delma, plus also Payne had spent the last few weeks looking into the couple and had learned more about Ted, including the fact that Ted had been at this animal control public forum 2 days before Delma was killed. That gathering was to discuss euthanizing all those cats that gathered behind the McDonald's, and Ted was very vocally opposed. However, the detective felt like Ted would cooperate once he understood the evidence that they had. So Payne just told him about the surveillance footage, and then waited for Ted to talk. But all Ted did was nod, and then in a very short voice, he said they were there the morning of the murder to feed the cats. But he said he and Lisa always did that and did not see anything strange, and they left by 2:15 a.m. When he heard this, Payne almost smiled, because while it wasn't a lie, it was close. Payne's team had managed to pull some additional surveillance footage from a business that was just 200 yards from the McDonald's, and that additional footage showed Ted and Lisa's car at that other business at 3:20 a.m. So even if they had left McDonald's before the murder, they were still clearly in the immediate area during the time Delma was attacked. But when confronted with this additional footage, Ted seemed totally unfazed, and also the rest of Payne's questions just really didn't go anywhere. So finally, Payne just ended the interview with Ted with a request. He asked him to take a polygraph. Now, Ted didn't seem happy about it, and Payne kind of readied himself to get an earful, but instead, to Payne's surprise, Ted agreed. After that, Payne spoke to Lisa, whose story lined up with Ted's for the most part. And so, Payne ultimately let the 2 of them go, because he didn't have enough evidence to keep them there. However, he was determined to find that evidence. Payne thought Lisa might be involved somehow, maybe she was a witness to the murder, but he didn't think she was the actual killer. Delma had been attacked by somebody who clearly was much stronger than her. And since there was only one person seen on that ATM footage going inside the building, Payne didn't think it was possible that both Ted and Lisa went inside. So he felt confident that single person must be Ted. And so Payne could not wait to see the results of Ted's polygraph. It would take several months to get Ted to actually sit for his polygraph, and when he did, he failed it. So that October, almost a year after Delma was murdered, Payne was finally given the go-ahead to search the couple's home. He and a team of officers went inside the home, ultimately taking the couple's computer, carpet fiber samples, and cat hair samples. And at some point during the hours-long search, one of Payne's officers called him over to look at a pile of discarded, dirty clothes. and in it was a pair of pants with what appeared to be a large bloodstain. Payne felt an immediate rush of excitement. Now, they would have to obviously test the blood to see whose it was, and they still had the Honda and Lisa's business to search as well, but based on what he was seeing already, Payne was sure they had just found Delma's killer. A few days later, though, Payne was sitting at his desk staring at a piece of paper with gut-wrenching disappointment. It was the results from a lab test on those bloody pants. According to the analysis, the blood was not human blood, so it couldn't be Delma's. Payne felt totally deflated, because it would turn out that blood was like the last bit of hope he'd had. After looking at the Honda and Lisa's store, they hadn't found anything that tied Ted and Lisa to the scene of the crime. Now, this didn't make them innocent, but Payne would need to find a lot more evidence if he wanted to make any charges stick. So once again, Payne found himself reaching for Delma's case file and rereading all the evidence he had. He was more sure than ever that Delma had to have been killed by somebody she knew. However, the two people closest to Delma, Emma and her husband Dennis, weren't very realistic suspects. Neither had a motive, and while at least Dennis seemed like he could have been physically capable enough to carry out such an attack, he had passed multiple polygraph tests. Then there were Ted and Lisa. Delma did know them, although she didn't like them. They were both in the area at the time of the murder, they had motives, and Ted had failed his polygraph. But there was no physical evidence that directly tied them to the crime. Plus, it was hard to imagine Delma happily letting either of them inside the McDonald's and then hanging out with them for 30 to 40 minutes before they attacked her? It just didn't make sense. And so Payne sighed and closed the file. He couldn't shake the feeling that Germantown's first homicide in 5 years was probably about to go cold. And for the next 18 months, that is exactly what happened. But then, one morning in May of 1999, Payne was sitting at his desk looking over a newer case file when an officer charged in saying that somebody had just called the Crime Stoppers tip line about Delma. Now, this person didn't give their name, and they were vague about how they had gotten their information, but they were apparently sure that they knew exactly who had killed Delma. And when Payne heard what this tipster had to say, his jaw dropped. The information was so utterly confounding that Payne almost couldn't wrap his head around it. He knew he would have to look through the case file before he even considered it. So he walked quickly down the hallway to where all the files were kept, and he grabbed Delma's. Then he flipped through it till he found what he was looking for, which was a report on one specific interview that was conducted in the very early days of the investigation. And Payne just stared at this interview for a long, long time. Because, as he was seeing now, there was something that the interview subject had said that could have solved the whole case right there if only Payne had thought to question it just a little bit harder at the time. Based on Payne's investigation, a confession, video surveillance, and evidence found at the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Delma Ramsey in the early morning hours of November 5th, 1997. Just after 3 a.m., the killer sat inside the McDonald's and watched Delma hang up the phone. She had just called Emma to wake her up. The killer's heart was beating fast, because they knew that now they only had 1 hour before Emma arrived at the McDonald's. The killer had spent the last 35 minutes or so just making small talk with Delma, who had been happy to see them. They knew Delma liked him, and to be honest, they sort of liked Delma too. But they really needed money, and now they knew they had to act. So that's when the killer stopped pretending to be at the McDonald's on some sort of friendly visit. Instead, they suddenly and very firmly told Delma she needed to open the safe or give them the combo to it. Delma turned and looked at them with a very confused expression on her face and just said no, which made the killer furious. And that's when something inside the killer just snapped. They lunged forward and hit Delma repeatedly and watched her grapple with the phone to try and call for help, but the killer just kept on attacking, even when they eventually heard Delma say the combo out loud. For a moment, the killer had been relieved, maybe they could take the combo, get the money, and get out. Then they realized in this moment, as they're still attacking Delma, that if they let her live, she'd be able to report them to the police. And so this made the killer panic. And since they hadn't brought a weapon with them, after beating her senseless, they began choking Delma with the closest thing they could find, which was her very own McDonald's apron, and they choked her until she stopped moving. Then, when she was still, the killer walked over to the safe, opened it up, and grabbed the money inside of it. Then they took Delma's keys from inside her pocket and ran to the exit they knew was the closest to the kitchen. They used those keys to unlock the door before sprinting out into the back, and they tossed the keys into the grass as they jumped into the car that was waiting for them. Once they were in the car, they told their accomplice to go, get out of here. Soon after they drove off, the killer counted out the cash and told their accomplice what they had done. Then the two of them left Tennessee and drove to Illinois. It would turn out Delma's best friend Emma's two grandsons really had left and moved to Illinois. But they had only moved after one of them, Robert Evans, had brutally murdered Delma Ramsey while the other, Maurice Lane, waited outside as a getaway driver. Robert knew from working at the McDonald's that Delma would be alone in the early morning hours. Delma had always treated him and his cousin Maurice like family, which was a connection he was counting on, because he knew that Delma would likely let him into the restaurant before it was open. Now, Robert didn't hate Delma, and he wasn't mad at her. That was not why he savagely beat her and strangled her. Instead, he was just a deeply disturbed and violent person. After killing Delma and fleeing to Illinois, he would also stab a friend to death after they got in a fight over a car stereo. Now, Emma Owens had told investigators about her grandsons, about how they had worked at this McDonald's, and they certainly knew Delma, but authorities didn't look into them because Emma had said they had moved to Illinois before the murder. Which means either Emma lied to police about the timing of when they moved to Illinois, which we now know followed the murder, or her grandsons had lied to Emma. Robert was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery and sentenced to life without parole. As for Maurice, he received 30 years in prison for his involvement. As for Ted and Lisa, who took care of the stray cats, although they were once suspects in this murder case, they were publicly vindicated. However, the damage was done. Their lives were ruined by the suspicion around them. It destroyed their marriage and their business, and Ted would eventually move back to Canada. On a cold day in January of 2017, a 26-year-old man named William Hargrove paced anxiously back and forth inside of his tiny bedroom. Will was nervous because he was about to take the biggest chance of his life. He was about to ask a woman, who he had only known for a few weeks, if she would marry him. Will looked around his bedroom and he saw there was dirty clothes coming out of his hamper and there was fast food trash all over the ground, and so he knew this was not the ideal location to ask someone to marry him, but he also knew he was running out of time. The woman he wanted to propose to, who was sitting right behind him on his bed, was about to head back to Russia where she lived in just a few hours. And so Will finally stopped pacing, he turned to face this woman on the bed, who was just sitting there silently, and Will was about to say something, but then he chickened out and just kept on pacing. To that point, Will's life had been pretty boring and lonely. He worked a low-paying job as a mechanic, and he lived in this bedroom. This was his apartment, this one room, which was being rented to him by a married couple who owned the house it was in. And this house was in a small city in the US state of Oregon. Will didn't really have any friends, and he didn't really have any meaningful hobbies. All he really had was his intense love of science fiction and fantasy. He would lose himself for hours watching movies about outer space and strange, distant alien planets and magic, and then often, after he would watch these movies, he would walk into the forest near his house, and he would just kind of wander around daydreaming about these movies, and he would pretend he was the hero from these movies. And suddenly, in his mind, Will would become a sorcerer with great powers, or a brilliant scientist who went back in time to save the world. But as much as Will loved daydreaming and fantasizing, what he really wanted was a wife and kids. And so recently, he had joined an international dating website, and it was through that website that he connected with 26-year-old Anna Repkina from Russia, who was the woman sitting on the bed behind him. And now, if Will could just muster the courage to pop the question to her, he was confident she would say yes, and he could finally start his real life with Anna. Anna, who had blonde hair and striking blue eyes, was a bit of a dreamer like Will. For example, she fundamentally believed that there was a soulmate somewhere in the world for everyone. However, to that point in her life, she had not found her soulmate. Instead, she had been through one bad breakup after another. But a few weeks earlier, when a short, stocky, bald guy with a bushy goatee, Will, had reached out to her on an international dating website and invited her to America to visit him, she believed it was fate that they were being brought together, and so Will had to be her soulmate. Will finally stopped pacing and turned again to face Anna, who was now reading a book on the edge of the bed. And Will, who was terrified at this point, took a deep breath and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a jewelry box. Inside of it was a beautiful emerald ring that was situated on a white gold band. And so Will took a step towards Anna, he dropped down to a knee, and he held out the jewelry box and he opened it up. At first, Anna didn't know what Will was doing and was kind of confused, but when she saw the ring and saw him on his knee, she knew what was happening, and she began trembling with excitement. And then Will, he pulled the ring out of its holder and he slipped it onto Anna's finger, and he asked her if she would marry him. And Anna, she began crying tears of joy and shouted, yes. Later that day, Anna would fly back home to Russia, but as soon as she landed, she began getting her affairs in order to go right back to Oregon to live with Will permanently. And 2 months later, in March of 2017, Anna was touching back down at the Oregon airport, and then right near the baggage claim, she had her big reunion with Will. That evening, when Anna and Will drove from the airport to Will's place, they parked the car, they got out, they grabbed Anna's luggage, they went up the front steps, and when Will unlocked the front door to go inside of the house to make their way up to his bedroom apartment, as soon as the door swung open, there was a woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, staring out at both of them. This woman was 34-year-old Michelle Chavez, and she and her husband were the married couple who rented the bedroom apartment to Will. Michelle had dark hair and piercing eyes, and even when she was being pleasant, she could be very intimidating. And right now, it was obvious she was not trying to be pleasant. And so Anna, who sensed something was wrong here, kind of awkwardly said hi to Michelle, but Michelle, she just glared at Anna and said nothing, and then looked from Anna to Will and said, Will, I need to talk to you. And then before Will could say anything, Michelle grabbed his arm and began dragging him through the house to the back. And as Will is kind of stumbling along after Michelle, he tried to be calm and told Anna, just go ahead and take your stuff up to the room. I'll be up there in a minute. And so Anna, she's very confused about what's happening here. She does not understand this dynamic at all, but she began taking her suitcases and marching over to the side of the house where Will's bedroom was. And as she did this, she could hear on the other side of the house, Michelle really yelling at Will, but Anna couldn't make out what Michelle was actually saying. And so at some point, when Anna was now inside of Will's bedroom, just kind of waiting, Will finally did come into the bedroom with his head hung down low, and Anna could just tell that, obviously he's just been yelled at, he looks defeated, and so Anna's trying to make eye contact with him, and finally, Will looks up at Anna, and Anna says, hey, what's going on? Why was she so upset? What's happening here? And in a quiet, trembling voice, Will would tell Anna that Michelle and her husband had just told him that they can't live here anymore. They have to move out. Anna couldn't believe this. She had just flown across the world to be here with Will, and now they don't have a place to live. But she could tell, obviously, Will is really upset about this too. And so instead of just being mad at him, she said, what's going on? Why is she kicking us out? And at first, Will kind of acted like he didn't really know. But then eventually, when Anna kept asking for more information, he would tell her that Michelle sort of had a crush on him. And when she saw Anna moving in with Will, she became really jealous and told them to leave. When Anna brought up the fact that Michelle was married, Will said, I know, she's married, the crush hasn't gone anywhere, but she still feels really jealous. Anna was obviously really upset about this situation, but after Will had explained what's going on with Michelle, Anna wasn't mad at Michelle, she actually felt kind of bad for her. It was sort of pathetic that this married woman was acting the way she was. And so Anna actually figured that really this is probably for the best, that we should get away from Michelle. And within a few days, Anna and Will had moved out of Michelle's place and found a place of their own in a neighboring town. And as soon as they were settled inside of there, it was like relief washed over both of them. And they both became really excited to plan their wedding and think about their future together. A few weeks later, on March 25th, 2017, Anna woke up early and put on her beautiful, simple white wedding dress that she brought from Russia, and then she and Will piled into his car and they headed to the beach. The couple had decided to go with a very simple, intimate outdoor wedding ceremony led by an officiant. An officiant is someone who can legally conduct a wedding. When the couple arrived at the beach, Anna hopped out and immediately began walking over the sand towards the water, and Will stayed back to call the officiant because he didn't see him anywhere. And so when Anna reached the water, she took in the beautiful sights and sounds of the beach. She felt the sun on her face and she listened to the sound of the waves crashing. And it was like suddenly she realized how lucky she was. I mean, this wedding day was turning out to be perfect when over the past couple of weeks, she wasn't sure if it was even going to happen. Even though Anna and Will had left Michelle's house and had no contact with her, over the past couple of weeks, Michelle had become a sort of thorn in their side, sending Anna all these really threatening messages, things like demanding that Anna share Will with her, or else she'll do something awful. And so Anna is thinking that Michelle is going to find a way to sabotage their wedding, but here they were on the beach about to get married with no Michelle in sight. And so at some point, Anna looked along the beach and saw a little bit farther along were the two friends that she and Will had invited to be a part of their wedding. And so Anna ran over to them and she hugged them and began chatting with them. And as she's chatting, she looks up and she sees Will coming down onto the beach and he's on his cell phone. And Anna can't tell what he's saying. He's too far away, but it's obvious there's something wrong. And by the time Will actually got up to the group, he had hung up his phone, but it was very obvious he was really upset. And as soon as he reached the group, he would announce to Anna and their friends that the officiant was not going to be able to make it. And so unfortunately, the wedding was off, at least for now. Now, Anna was totally crushed by this, but she could tell Will also was totally crushed by this. And so instead of crying and making Will feel worse, Anna put on a brave face and told Will, "Don't worry about it. We will find another officiant. We'll reschedule this. It will be fine." And so Anna and Will's friends, they said bye and they headed their way, and Anna and Will had a very somber walk along the beach back to their car. But on the drive from the beach back to their apartment, they would stop at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, and they would get some food, and by the time they had made it back to their apartment, they were laughing about how ridiculous it was that they were eating fast food in their wedding clothes. A couple weeks later, Anna was still in the process of rescheduling their wedding, and she was starting to feel very frustrated with Will. Over the last week or so, Will, instead of helping her with the wedding, was spending much of his time outside of the apartment, pacing around, chain smoking, while talking to someone on the phone. Now, Anna didn't know who he was talking to, but based on how stressed out he seemed, Anna assumed he had to be talking to either Michelle or talking to someone else about Michelle. Regardless, Anna knew this had to, in some way, be connected to Michelle. However, whenever Anna would approach Will and ask him why he was so stressed and whether or not he was still in contact with Michelle, Will would try to change the subject, or he would just clam up and not talk at all. But finally, on April 16th, so 3 weeks after the couple's first failed wedding attempt, Will would approach Anna and ask her very sheepishly if she would come with him on a walk through the woods, because he had something important he wanted to tell her. Now, Anna knew that Will loved walking in these woods. He still went off and daydreamed after his movies. And so she knew that if he's asking her to go out there to talk, that this was going to be a very serious conversation, most likely about Michelle and whatever's going on. And so the couple piled into Will's car and they drove to the parking lot right near the woods. They got out, they hopped on a path, and they began walking into the trees. And for a while, they didn't really talk to each other. They just walked quietly side by side through the woods. But at some point, Will began to slow down and then finally came to a full stop, at which point Anna stopped too, and she turned to face him. And when she did, Will paused for a moment and then with a shaky voice told Anna that he felt like they rushed into their relationship and he wanted to call off the engagement. Anna was so caught off guard and heartbroken by what she was hearing that she couldn't say anything. She just stood there in stunned silence and then finally just turned around and stormed off away from Will deeper into the woods until she was out of Will's sight. The next day, when Will woke up, the first thing he did was pick up his phone and text Anna. But Anna didn't write back. And so as Will is laying in bed, he couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of regret about the decision he had made the day before. He wanted Anna back. So, over the course of the next several hours, Will would send Anna a series of increasingly more desperate-sounding text messages, pleading with her to just talk to him, please. But she didn't respond to any of his messages. And so Will decided that the only way he could get Anna back would be if he did something big. So he hopped out of his bed, he grabbed his cigarettes, he went outside, and he began pacing and chain smoking, trying to come up with whatever big idea was going to get Anna back. And at some point, an idea came to him. He would do what he had seen heroes do in several of his favorite science fiction and fantasy movies. He would use time travel to go back in time and get Anna back. Feeling totally energized by this idea, Will ran back inside his apartment, he grabbed another pack of cigarettes, a 6-pack of soda, and then he sat down at his computer and he scoured the internet for any information about how to build a time-traveling machine. And for the next 24 to 48 hours, Will stayed at his computer, chain smoking and drinking sodas, drawing all these sketches of different time machine designs that he found on the internet. But at some point, after 24 to 48 hours, Will realized that no matter how good these sketches were, he lacked 1, the resources, and 2, the knowledge and expertise of how to take this sketch and actually make it into a real physical time machine. And so feeling totally frustrated, Will took a sketchbook and threw it, and then lay down on his bed, feeling somewhat defeated. But as he laid there thinking about Anna, he had another epiphany. In other science fiction and fantasy movies, sometimes the heroes didn't need to use time machines to go back in time, they would use magic. And so suddenly Will decided, oh my goodness, I need to find the right magical spell that will allow me to travel back in time and get Anna. And so once again, he ran back to his computer, continued chain smoking and drinking sodas while scouring the internet looking for the right magical spell that would take him back in time. And several times he communicated with strangers on the internet, telling them that he would sell his soul to them if they could give him the right spell. And then anytime he thought he found the right spell, he would close his eyes and chant the words out loud, and then open his eyes only to realize he was stuck in the present. And so finally, after basically staying awake for 72 hours on this quest to go back in time to get Anna back, Will realized that it was not going to work, and so he gave up. The next morning, on April 19th, so this is 3 days after he broke up with Anna in the woods, Will heard a knock on his front door. And when he opened the door, there were 2 police officers standing there. And when Will asked them, what's going on, they told him that they actually needed his help, and would he mind coming to the station to talk to them. And so Will, he was still totally exhausted from not having slept over the last 3 days, but he of course agreed to go. And when he got to the police station, he was led into a small interview room, and he sat down behind this metal desk in front of the other 2 officers, and he asked them, what can I do for you? And one of the officers eventually asked Will if he had recently eaten at a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. That's a fast food restaurant also known as KFC. Will was puzzled and almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't understand how this was important. But when he saw that these 2 officers were not making light of this at all, they were very serious, Will said, yeah, a few days ago I did eat at a KFC. Why does that matter? To understand why it mattered, we need to understand the relationship between Will and Michelle. It would turn out Michelle did not just have a crush on Will. Michelle and Will had been having an intense affair right in Michelle's house with her husband since 2015, so a full year before Will met Anna. Now, Will had wanted Michelle to leave her husband and be with him, and Michelle had told Will that she wanted the same thing, but she couldn't do it right now. And so to show Will that she was serious, that one day she would be with him, she gave him her wedding ring, which was an emerald stone sitting on a white gold band. It was like a promise ring, that this is my token to you to show you that one day we will be together in public. But as time went on, Michelle didn't really show any signs of trying to leave her husband, and so Will started to wonder if he was just kind of letting his life slip by. Because remember, Will really wanted a wife and kids, and it was starting to look like Michelle was not going to give him either of those things. And so that was why Will went on that dating site and contacted Anna, and then when he learned that Anna wanted a family too, he had asked her to marry him. The ring that Will gave Anna when he proposed to her was the same ring that Michelle had given Will. Her wedding ring, the promise ring. And so when Michelle saw that ring on Anna's finger on a Facebook post that Anna made about having been proposed to by Will, Michelle was enraged. And then just a few weeks later, when Anna showed up at Michelle's house to move into Will's bedroom with him, she grabbed Will, dragged him to the side of the house, and said, "You need to choose right now between me and Anna." And because Will couldn't come up with an answer, Michelle kicked him and Anna out of the house. However, over the following weeks, despite Michelle having booted them from her property, she could not let go of her jealousy of Anna and her love for Will. And so she sent Anna all these threatening messages on Facebook demanding that she share Will with her or else, and she began incessantly calling and texting Will demanding that he choose her over Anna. And so when Anna saw Will walking around outside chain-smoking cigarettes on the phone, Anna was right in suspecting that that was Michelle that he was talking to. But despite all this pressure, Will just could not make up his mind. He didn't know which woman he wanted to be with more. And so to buy himself some time, he had lied to Anna about hiring an officiant for their wedding on the beach. And then when they arrived on the beach and Will said the officiant had canceled, it was all a ruse. There was never any officiant. He was just trying to buy time for himself. But finally, on April 16th, for whatever reason, Will had decided that he knew which woman he wanted to go with. He wanted to go with Michelle. So he brought Anna out into the woods and he told her the news that he was breaking off the engagement and effectively their relationship was over, at which point Anna turned and stormed off into the woods. And so Will, he watched her disappear, and then he turned around and walked back along the path back toward his car. And when he got there, he opened his trunk and got something out of it, and then he walked back along the trail into the woods where he had seen Anna last. And when he reached that spot, he kind of walked off in the direction that Anna had wandered, and eventually he spotted Anna. She was standing in a clearing, looking up into the sky, seemingly lost in thought. And so Will quietly walked up right behind her, and then he raised the shotgun he had gotten out of his trunk. He placed the barrel against the back of Anna's skull, and before she could even react, say something, turn around, do anything, he pulled the trigger. Afterward, he ran back down the trail to his car, and he gathered up all of Anna's things that happened to be inside of the car, along with some trash on the floor of the car, and then he brought all of that stuff back into the woods and kind of dumped it both on and around Anna's body. The next day, a walker and their dog happened to come across Anna's body, and when the police were called out to the site, they began sifting through all of the trash that was kind of scattered around Anna's body. And inside of a crumpled up KFC bag, the police would find a receipt for the day of the murder. And that receipt belonged to Will. The morning after Will killed Anna, he sent those initial text messages to Anna just to cover his tracks. But as he sent them, he actually did feel an enormous sense of regret about the decision he made. He no longer wanted Michelle, he wanted Anna. And it was at that point that he decided he would do what the heroes in some of his favorite movies did. He would go back in time and undo the murder and get his love back. But of course, his efforts would fail. And in January of 2020, 3 years after Anna's murder, Will was sentenced to life in prison. As for Michelle, she was never charged with any crime. At around 5 p.m. on August 29, 1954, a 53-year-old woman named Juliet Exline had just sat down on her couch with a book inside of her home in Los Angeles when she got this weird wave of anxiety that kind of rushed over her. Now, there was nothing she could think of that would cause her to feel this way, and she even looked around her house thinking, maybe there was something weird going on, but there was nothing. And so finally, Juliet, she put her book down and just took a few calming breaths to kind of go back to normal. Like, she didn't know what was going on, but she could tell she was super anxious. Now, generally speaking, Juliet was a very mellow person. She was not prone to anxiety attacks like this, and so that kind of caught her off guard. And the only thing she could think of that was different than normal was her husband, Larry, was on a much needed vacation. And so the last couple of days while he'd been gone had been maybe more lonely in the house. And so maybe that was causing her to feel this weird stress. She didn't know, but she told herself, Larry's vacation was definitely a good thing. Larry was an exterminator, and over the past 2 years, he had not taken a single day off. He was a total workaholic, and so when Larry began to talk about wanting to take a break, Juliet had encouraged him to put in time for some vacation time, put in a request. And Frank had actually done that, and as soon as his boss had approved a 2-week-long vacation, Larry had been so pumped, he had called his friend, and they had immediately scheduled a fishing trip, and 4 days before, Frank and his friend had driven off to enjoy his time off. And so as Juliet thought about that, she told herself that, even if she was feeling a little bit anxious about Larry being gone, it really was a good thing for Larry, and it would improve not only his life, but her life as well. This was overall a good thing, and so she just needed to kind of deal with this anxiety that maybe or maybe not was connected to Larry. She didn't know. But for the rest of that evening, Juliet just could not get rid of this kind of baseline low-level nervousness she was feeling. And so at some point, she began getting up and walking around her house and confirming all the windows were shut and locked and the doors were locked. She was drawing curtains, checking in closets, making sure everything was totally safe. And then by 8 p.m., when she still just could not shake this anxiety, she decided she just needed to go to bed and kind of sleep this off. But after falling asleep, Juliet suddenly woke up at 10:15 p.m., drenched in sweat, with the most intense anxiety she had ever felt in her life. And she was totally disoriented. She's looking around her room like, what's going on here? And then she heard a voice. It was Larry's voice, except he sounded funny. He sounded like quiet, as if maybe he was outside the house trying to come in and he was calling to her. And so kind of in a panic, she jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and right in the hallway was Larry. He wasn't outside. He was right there. Except something was wrong with Larry. He was kind of hunched over and grabbing his stomach, and he had his hand on the wall, and he also appeared to be soaking wet. And so Juliet had no idea what was going on, but between all that anxiety and now seeing Larry here in this weird state, she couldn't help herself. She just ran towards him to just make sure he was okay. But as soon as she got about a foot away from him, he held out his hand and said, "No, don't touch me. I have to go back." And what he said was so disorienting that Juliet just stopped and stared at her husband like, what is this? And that's when she made the startling realization that Larry was not soaking wet with water. He was soaking wet with blood, and he was clutching his stomach like something was bleeding in his midsection. And the reason he had sounded so quiet when he had called out to her and woken her up was because he was clearly hurt. And so Juliet has no clue what's going on. Like, her husband was supposed to be 7 hours away on this fishing trip. And so how is he here? It didn't make any sense. And so really not knowing what else to do, Juliet just said, I'm going to call the doctor. And so she ran past Larry, headed to the kitchen, and she was about to grab the phone on the wall. But before she could grab it, the phone began to ring. And so Juliet just answered it and said, hello, hello. And what she heard was the sound of a sheriff in Ely, Nevada. And he said, excuse me, is this Mrs. Exline, Juliet Exline? And she said, yes, what's going on? What's happened? And the sheriff said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I have some terrible news. Your husband got into a car accident, and unfortunately, he has passed away. And now the second the sheriff said this to Juliet, she just froze and goes, no, that's not possible. He's here with me right now. And Juliet turned around and looked into the hallway where Larry had been standing, and now Larry was gone. Larry really had died in that car accident because Juliet would bury her husband that week. But Juliet maintained that clearly after her husband had died, his spirit had somehow survived the accident, because when she saw her husband standing in the hallway, hunched over and covered in blood, it was at 10:15 p.m. She remembers because when she woke up, she saw the time. It was 10:15. And her husband had died at exactly 10:15 p.m., the exact moment she saw him in the hallway. Juliet would ultimately write an account of what she experienced with her husband. However, from that day forward, she never once saw her husband again. That was the only time. At 12:30 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV, upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV, and so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing and pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here, there's a baby in here." And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped these straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away. He figured the first responders will handle this woman and he's going to take this baby to safety because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer Grossbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know. But we know at 10:30, she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard and they do not have an explanation for it. At around 9 p.m. on October 26, 2009, a 19-year-old college student named Mako Hioka bagged up the last bit of trash inside of the ice cream parlor where she worked, and she dumped it into a bag and she tied that bag up. It was closing time, and so Mako looked around the inside of the parlor, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and then she flipped off the lights, threw her purse over her shoulder, she grabbed that bag of trash, she headed outside the parlor, she shut and locked the door, she dumped the trash in a nearby bin, and then began walking towards the exit of the mall, which is where this parlor was located. It was inside of this big mall. Mako went to school in a city called Hamada City, which is located on the coast of Japan in an area called the Shimane Prefecture. And Hamada City was a totally beautiful and very remote location with these amazing beaches and unbelievable mountains with all these ski resorts on it. I mean, this was an incredible place to live. But as much as Mako did love living there, she was actually far more excited about where she'd be living the next year because she was doing an exchange program. She'd be studying in Russia, and that was so exciting for her. And in fact, this exchange program was the reason why Mako had picked up this job at this ice cream parlor, because she came from a family that was not poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot of extra income, and Mako felt strongly that she really wanted to pay her way to go do this big Russian exchange program because it wasn't cheap, and so she was picking up as many shifts as she could to save up money to pay her way. And so Mako eventually reached the exit of this mall, and she stepped outside into the night, and then she had a decision she needed to make, and she needed to make this decision every night after work. There were two ways that she could get back to her dorm, which was located about a mile away. The quick way would be to just hop on a bus and have the bus take her to her dorm, but that cost money. And remember, Mako is trying to save up as much money as she can to pay for Russia next year. And so taking the bus just felt like, not really worth it. And the other option, which was free, was much longer and frankly just plain spooky. And Mako hated it. What it entailed was basically just walking to her dorm, but it would mean walking for about a third of a mile through this really spooky forest that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Now, up until recently, Miyako's coworker had always left with her at the same time, and they lived roughly in the same area, and so they would walk together through that forest, saving money, and also, providing each other security as they went through the spooky area. But recently, the coworker had quit, and so now Mako was all alone. And so as Mako stood there wondering what she should do, take the bus route or take the forest route, she just thought about, next year, it's all going to be worth it. I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to pay my way. It's going to be awesome. And after all, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a few minutes walking through a forest. I've done dozens of times. Before long, I'll be in my brightly lit, safe dorm room, studying away, and everything will be fine. And so Mako turned and began walking towards the forest. The following day, a little past 4 p.m., the owner of the ice cream shop where Mako worked was standing inside the parlor feeling really annoyed, because Mako had not shown up for her shift, and now the owner, who normally did a lot of administrative and managerial things, was stuck at the counter serving all the customers, basically doing Miyako's job. But when 5 p.m. came and still Mako had not shown up, and the owner had tried calling her and she didn't pick up, and there was just no sign of her, the owner went from being annoyed to being somewhat worried. And so after again not being able to call Mako to figure out what was going on, he wound up going through her file and finding her mother's phone number, and he called her. And when he spoke to Miyako's mother, he knew right away there was something wrong, because Miyako's mother actually was pretty panicked, and she said, "You know what? Last night when Miyako was coming home from work, she told me she would call me when she got to her dorm, but I never heard from her and I haven't been able to get in touch with her since. And so after this conversation ended, Miyako's mother would call the police and report her daughter missing. And pretty much instantly, the police in Hamada City responded in force. I mean, they launched a huge investigation to go figure out what happened to Miyako. And really the reason behind that is because Hamada City is this unbelievable place, this secluded, safe place where things like this did not happen. And frankly, it scared everybody and they wanted to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so what police did at first is they went and looked at security footage from the ice cream parlor where they knew she had been working on the night she went missing. And sure enough, at about 9:16 p.m., there's footage of her walking out of the ice cream parlor in the mall. She's got a purse over her shoulder and, she shuts and locks the door, she throws the trash away, and then she heads towards the exit. But after that, nobody saw her. There was no more footage, there was no more tips or anything. She just vanished once she left the mall. And so very quickly, this story gained lots of attention because again, Hamada City is like this quintessential vacation spot. It's so perfect, it's so safe. And to have this girl just go missing, it was scandalous. And so it made the news all over Hamada City. And also people who lived in Hamada City were suddenly on edge at night. What's out there snatching people up? In fact, Miyako's college, during the few days following her disappearance, they set a curfew for all their students. Like all their students had to be back in their dorms at a certain time to keep them safe. But again, despite the police really leaning into this case from the jump and putting all their manpower and all their resources into this, they really had no idea what happened to Miyako. Then, on November 6th, 2009, so 11 days after Miyako went missing, a man who was hunting for mushrooms up on this mountainside about 15 miles away from the ice cream parlor believed he spotted this beautiful mushroom sitting underneath a few fallen leaves. And so excited, the guy runs over and he begins moving away the leaves to grab this big meaty mushroom. But as soon as he grabbed the skin of this mushroom and began to pull, he stopped. And then he quickly turned and began sprinting back down the path that had brought him up here. And as he was running, he pulled his phone out and he saw he had no service and he just kept on running and holding the phone up looking for service. And then finally, when he was about halfway down the mountain, he saw he had service in his phone and he called the police. And the second the dispatcher answered, this man began screaming, "I found a human head!" When police arrived on that mountainside where this man claimed to have found a human head, well, they confirmed he was right. They found Miyako's severed head right underneath those leaves. And the reason this guy thought her head was a mushroom, a dark-colored mushroom, because it was obvious that Miyako's face had been so badly beaten and it was all black and blue before she lost her head. And so this mushroom hunter had literally thought that was a big, big mushroom. And so at this point, the Hamada City police shifted their area of search from around the mall and the ice cream parlor where they thought they would find Miyako to this forested mountain area where her head was found. And now, of course, it was no longer a search and rescue, it was a recovery mission. They're just looking for the rest of Miyako's body. And over the next couple of days, as police searched this forested mountainside, they would find different parts of Miyako all over the place. And then after they had found, all the pieces to Miyako, the running theory based on what they were seeing is that very likely she had been strangled to death and then her body was burned and then she was dismembered and scattered throughout this forested mountain area. But there was very little evidence about who had actually done this to Miyako. Miyako had no enemies to speak of. Everybody who spoke about Miyako said she was incredibly lovely and kind, and really there wasn't anybody in her life that would want to do her harm. And also because Miyako's body had been destroyed and left out for so long, any trace evidence left behind by her killer or killers was basically non-existent. And so the police really had no leads to speak of. They had no suspects or anything. And so they called in psychologists to try to make, a profile of who they thought might have done this. And the best theory anyone could come up with was that this had been a random crime of opportunity, that the person who killed her didn't know her, and that likely her killer was a man who was likely between the ages of 20 and 40. But even that information really didn't narrow anything down, and so quickly this case began to go cold. But as the police investigation itself began to go cold, the kind of lore around the story was only growing. I mean, this really seemed like a totally unbelievable case considering where it happened. I mean, Hamada City is like this perfect place. How could this happen here? And so what started as being kind of a local news story, albeit a big local news story, became a major national story all over Japan. And so all these TV outlets and journalists were descending on Hamada City, and they were taking video of the ice cream parlor and of the police department and filming, Miyako's dorm and her school and her parents' house. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get any bit of information to report on about this case. And despite there being dozens and dozens of these live reports basically every day coming out of Hamada City about this case and about Miyako, there was one particular news report that took this case from being, totally unfortunate and sad and tragic and horrible to completely unbelievable and bizarre. Shortly after Miyako's remains had basically all been found, but they were still doing some recovery operations up on that mountainside, one of these kind of random TV reporters who was in Hamada City to report on this crazy case decided to set up their TV camera so it was pointing towards the dark entrance of that spooky forest that Miyako would walk through to get back to her dorm. And so this TV news reporter's got their microphone and, they're standing with the forest entrance right behind them, and the cameraman's filming, looking towards this opening of the forest. And the actual report was pretty generic. I mean, this reporter was basically saying, well, coming at you live from Hamada City, just outside of the forest where perhaps Miyako was killed. And it was just like that. It was just kind of talking about the case, and there was nothing to it. At least not to the TV reporter and the cameraman who were on site. Because for them, the entire report was pretty routine. They did their job, they got their shot, they got their report, and then they left. But they streamed it live. So while they were doing it, all these people are tuned in watching this news report live in front of this forest. And something really unsettling happened on this broadcast. While that news reporter was talking, another voice began to be heard by people watching this broadcast. And it was not the cameraman, and it was certainly not the TV journalist. It was a woman's voice. And there was no woman anywhere near the shot. And after the fact, the journalist and the cameraman would also attest that there was nobody around, it was just them. But this detached, very pained voice said very clearly, and all these people heard it live, "This is very painful. Why only me?"
広島県北広島町の我流山の林道の入り口です。今日の捜索は午後5時で終了し、私の後ろに張られていた規制線も現在は解かれています。
And so after this news report happened, this story, this case about Miyako, went from being just a Japanese story to being like an international sensation, because everybody believed when they saw this video that that voice that was heard was Miyako's ghost, basically talking on camera. That's why you can't see her. It's her spirit communicating with the living world. However, despite that drawing even more attention to this case, it didn't remotely help the police actually solve the case. They still had no idea who did this. And that's how this case would stay for years, just totally stalled. That is, until 7 years later, when a police officer was conducting a routine police review of old criminal case files that hadn't been solved, going through them all to see if maybe evidence had been missed, and maybe that was why the case had not been solved. And so this police officer is looking through all these case files, and when they landed on the Miyako case, they did discover a piece of evidence that had been totally overlooked. It was the file of a convicted sex offender named Yoshiharu Yano. Yoshiharu was a 33-year-old man who had served time in prison for assaults on 3 different women in Tokyo, which is 500 miles away from Yamada City, where Miyako was killed. And because of that 500-mile gap between Tokyo and Hamada City, Yoshiharu had been completely overlooked in terms of being a suspect in Miyako's murder. It just seemed like he was too far away to be involved. But the police officer who was doing that routine review, they discovered that right before Miyako was murdered, this Yoshiharu guy had been let out of prison and decided to live in Hamada City. And on the night Miyako was killed, when she decided to walk into that forest, well, they found security footage of Yoshiharu's car driving along around that forest and up near that mountain where Miyako's remains were all discovered. And so this investigator who discovered this piece of information got permission from higher-ups to search Yoshiharu's home where he was living right then. And when they searched his home, they discovered a digital camera with 40 photos on it that would explain what happened to Miyako. It was very clear Yoshiharu had murdered Miyako, because some of the pictures contain photos of Miyako and they are just horrible. But figuring out who Miyako's killer was was not the end of this case. In fact, it wasn't even the most shocking part of this case. The most shocking part of this case is what happened to Miyako's killer, Yoshiharu, basically right after she was murdered, and that voice, that detached female voice, was heard on that TV news report. 7 years earlier, right around the time that Miyako's head had been found, and also after that voice had been heard on the TV newscast, some people who were driving in a car north of Hamada City began calling the police to report something very strange. They called the police and said, there is this small white Toyota Corolla car that has 2 people inside of it, and they've driven to the side of the road, and the driver is ramming over and over again against the railing. Like they're smashing into the railing, backing up, smashing over and over again, like the car is somehow in control. They don't understand how these people are not getting out of the car. Like, what are they doing? Traffic had stopped on either side. It was just totally nonsensical. And then by the time the police showed up, this car that was just repeatedly driving into the side of this guardrail, it burst into flames with the 2 people inside still clearly alive and looking terrified, and they caught on fire and died. Now, at the time, this did make the news. It looked very much like some sort of weird murder-suicide where the driver had intentionally, driven the car until it burst into flames and killed themselves and also their passenger. But it didn't really amount to more than just a really weird news story because there was no connection to the Miyako case. This is like a totally isolated thing. However, 7 years later, when that police officer discovered the link that Yoshiharu was in Hamada City, and then they figured out, yep, Yoshiharu was the killer, well, suddenly, that totally weird murder-suicide took on a whole new meaning, because the driver of that car was Yoshiharu, and the passenger was his mother. And again, from eyewitness testimony, it didn't really make sense the way this all happened. It was almost like the car was possessed or something, that, the passengers couldn't control it. Now, who knows if that's true, but when you combine it with the sound of that female voice on the TV news camera that everybody assumed was Miyako's ghost saying, "This is so painful, why only me?" suddenly those words took on a new meaning. People thought, you know what it is? Miyako's ghost must have taken control of that car and made sure not only Yoshiharu suffered and died, but his family member died as well, that she was seeking her revenge on her killer. As promised, here is a clip from the newest episode of the Bedtime Stories podcast, Enjoy.
Despite the invention of satellite communications and GPS tracking, ships and planes continue to vanish from across the globe, leaving no trace of their passing. Simultaneously, the remains of mysterious boats wash up on remote shorelines,